The dust motes danced in the tired afternoon sunbeams slanting through the grimy windows of the Sip and Save corner store, a place that time had clearly forgotten and cleanliness had never known. For Eleanor Vance, it was simply the only place within walking distance. Her hands, gnarled with the arthritis of 83 winters, trembled slightly as she counted out the collection of coins on the sticky counter. A loaf of bread, a small carton of milk, and a single can of vegetable soup. A feast for a queen on a Tuesday. The total came to $4.12. Her palm held $3.98. A 14-cent deficit that felt like a canyon. The cashier, a teenager named Kevin with apathy etched into his face like a tribal tattoo, sighed dramatically. "Look, lady, I ain't a charity. It's $4.12. You got it or you don't." Eleanor's cheeks flushed a pale pink. I'm sure I have it." Just a moment, she fumbled with the clasp of her worn leather purse, a relic from a time when things were built to last, much like the woman who carried it. Behind her, a snicker cut through the stale air. 3 young men, swaggering with the unearned confidence of youth, shifted impatiently. Their leader, a wiry man with cold, flat eyes and a tattoo of a snake coiling up his neck, leaned forward. "Problem, Grandma?" he sneered, his voice a low, mocking drawl. "Can't afford your cat food?" His 2 companions chuckled, the sound wet and unpleasant. Eleanor ignored them, her focus entirely on the frustratingly small world inside her purse. A folded handkerchief, a tarnished silver locket, but no more coins. The flush on her cheeks deepened into a painful, burning red. I seem to be a little short," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Humiliation was a bitter meal, one she had been forced to eat more often in her later years. "Then get out of the way," the leader, Marco, snapped. He nudged the man in front of him, who then deliberately shoved his hip into the small of Eleanor's back. She stumbled forward, her fragile balance failing her. The bread and milk tumbled from her grasp. The milk carton hit the linoleum with a sickening thud, splitting open and bleeding a white puddle across the dirty floor. The can of soup rolled away, its metallic clatter echoing the sudden, sharp silence in the store. Marco laughed, a harsh, grating sound that filled the void. "Look at that. Now you've got nothing." He kicked the can of soup, sending it skittering under a shelving unit laden with dusty bags of chips. He planted his foot deliberately in the spreading puddle of milk, grinding his boot as if to erase its existence. "Clean that up," he commanded Kevin, who just stared, wide-eyed and useless. Marco then turned his full, venomous attention back to Eleanor. He saw her worn coat, her scuffed shoes, the purse that had seen better decades, and his face twisted into a mask of pure contempt. He saw weakness, and like a predator, he felt the instinct to crush it. "Maybe if you weren't so busy being old and useless, you could afford your own damn groceries. Wasting everyone's time." The other customers, a young mother with a toddler and an old man nursing a coffee in the corner booth, averted their eyes. Their silence was a form of consent, a thick blanket of indifference that suffocated the air in the small store. The mother pulled her child closer, shielding his eyes not from the spilled milk, but from the raw, ugly cruelty on display. The old man, Jed, took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee, his gaze fixed on the scene over the rim of his cup, his face an unreadable mask of wrinkles. Eleanor stood frozen in the middle of it all, a solitary island in a sea of silent judgment, the cold seep of spilled milk soaking into the hem of her coat. The world had shrunk to the size of this grimy floor, this sneering face, and the 14 cents she did not have. Marco wasn't finished. The silence of the room seemed to fuel his sadism, the averted gazes a spotlight for his performance. He stepped closer to Eleanor, invading her personal space until she could smell the cheap cologne and stale cigarette smoke on his jacket. He was enjoying this, the power he wielded over this frail, silent woman. "What's the matter, Grandma? Cat got your tongue?" he taunted, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow louder than his previous shouts. "Or did you forget your lines? The part where you beg for a handout?" His friends snickered again, a loyal chorus to his cruelty. Eleanor bent down slowly, her joints protesting with a series of quiet clicks and groans. Her first instinct, a habit born from a lifetime of quiet resilience, was to salvage what she could. Her hand reached for the loaf of bread, now slightly crushed and damp at one end. As her fingers brushed against the plastic wrapper, Marco's foot shot out, not kicking her, but pinning the loaf to the floor. "I don't think so," he said, grinding the soft bread under the heel of his boot. "That's store property now. Damaged goods." A collective intake of breath, sharp and horrified, came from the young mother near the magazine rack. It was the only sound of protest, and it died as quickly as it was born when Marco shot her a venomous glare. She flinched and turned away completely, her back now a solid wall of non-involvement. The message was clear: stay out of it. Eleanor slowly straightened up, her hand retreating, empty. She didn't look at the crushed bread or the sneering face above it. She looked past him, at a faded poster of a smiling family advertising soda, a relic of a happier, simpler world. The contrast was a physical blow, a reminder of everything she had lost, of the world that no longer seemed to have a place for her. The cashier, Kevin, finally found his voice, though it was thin and reedy. "Hey man, just leave her alone. Take your stuff and go." It was a weak attempt at authority, and Marco treated it with the contempt it deserved. He turned his head slowly, a predator assessing a non-threat. "What did you say, kid?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. "I'm having a conversation with the lady. We're discussing economics." He turned back to Eleanor. "See? The problem is you think you're entitled to things. Food, respect. But you gotta earn it." He reached out and poked her shoulder with a single, grimy finger. It was a small gesture, but the violation was immense. He was touching her, marking her with his disdain. "And you haven't earned a damn thing." Each word was a stone, and Eleanor felt their weight piling up inside her, threatening to crush the fragile architecture of her composure. She could feel the stares of everyone in the room, even if they weren't looking directly at her. She was a spectacle, a cautionary tale. This is what happens when you get old, when you are poor, when you are alone. The world will step on you and not even notice the crunch. The silence wasn't just indifference anymore. It was complicity. Every person who said nothing, who did nothing, was holding her down for Marco, allowing him to continue his assault on her dignity. The pressure was immense, a physical force pressing in on her from all sides. She felt her knees tremble, not from fear, but from the sheer, exhausting weight of it all. In that moment, her mind fled the grimy linoleum floor of the sip and save. It flew back 50 years, to a sun-drenched porch swing and the feel of a strong, warm hand holding hers. Arthur's hand. Her husband. He wasn't a large man, but he had a presence that could fill a room, a quiet certainty that was as solid as granite. He had come home from the war with a limp and eyes that had seen too much, but his spirit was untouched. He had a code, a set of rules so deeply ingrained they were part of his DNA. "Dignity, Ellie," he used to say, his voice a low rumble like the engine of the motorcycle he so loved. "It's the only thing they can't take from you unless you give it to them. You don't have to win. You just have to not break." She remembered a time years ago at a county fair. A much younger man, drunk and belligerent, had knocked over a child's ice cream cone and laughed. Arthur hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't thrown a punch. He had simply stepped in front of the man, looked him square in the eye and said, "You will buy the boy a new one, and you will apologize." The man had blustered and postured, but something in Arthur's gaze, a complete and utter lack of fear, had deflated him. The man bought the ice cream. Arthur's strength wasn't in his fists. It was in his spine. He was part of a motorcycle club back then, a brotherhood forged in the fires of war and the freedom of the open road. They weren't thugs. They were knights on iron horses, bound by loyalty and a fierce, unspoken code of honor. He called them his brothers, and they treated her like a queen. That world was long gone. Arthur had passed 20 years ago, and the club members had scattered, grown old, or died. She was alone now, the keeper of a memory, the last guardian of a forgotten code. But the code itself was not forgotten. It lived in her. It was the steel in her spine, the legacy of the man she had loved. He had taught her that you stand your ground, not with aggression, but with unyielding self-respect. You don't let them see you crumble. You don't give them the satisfaction. The memory was a warm current in the frozen landscape of her present humiliation. It was an anchor. She felt the strength of Arthur's hand in hers again, a ghostly but powerful presence. He was there, reminding her who she was. She was Eleanor Vance. She was Arthur Vance's wife, and she would not break. The pressure in the store had reached a breaking point. The air was thick with unspoken tension, a silence stretched so tight it was about to snap. Marco, emboldened by the lack of resistance, decided to escalate. His cruel amusement had curdled into a genuine, ugly anger. Her silence was a defiance he couldn't comprehend, and it infuriated him. He wanted her to cry, to beg, to validate his power over her. Her quiet composure was an insult. "I'm talking to you," he snarled, and his hand shot out, grabbing her thin arm just above the elbow. His grip was surprisingly strong, his fingers digging into her fragile skin like talons. The shock of the physical contact was a bolt of lightning through Eleanor's system. It was no longer just words. It was an assault. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and for a terrifying second, she thought her legs might give out. The faces around her blurred. The young mother had her hands over her child's ears now, her face pale with distress. Kevin the cashier stood frozen behind the counter, his mouth slightly agape, looking like a frightened fish. And Jed, the old man in the corner, had put his coffee cup down. His eyes, which had been passive observers, now narrowed. They were fixed on Marco's hand on Eleanor's arm. He didn't move, not yet, but something in his posture had shifted. He was no longer just watching, he was waiting. Marco gave her arm a slight shake. "You deaf? Or just stupid? I asked you a question." He leaned in closer, his foul breath washing over her face. "You're going to apologize to me for wasting my time. Right now, this was the final demand, the ultimate humiliation." He didn't just want to shame her. He wanted her to participate in her own debasement. He wanted to hear her voice crack, to see her spirit surrender. He wanted to take her dignity and smash it on the floor next to the spilled milk and crushed bread. The entire store seemed to be holding its breath. This was the moment of decision. Would she crumble? Would she finally give him the pathetic, broken reaction he craved? Every onlooker was a silent juror in this trial of spirit. Their inaction was its own verdict, a judgment on their own character as much as hers. They were witnesses, and their silence was a heavy, damning thing. Eleanor could feel it, a physical weight pushing down on her shoulders, adding to the pressure of Marco's grip. She was utterly, completely alone. But the memory of Arthur was a shield, and the code he lived by was her armor. The world could be cruel, people could be weak, but her own soul was a fortress, and its gates would not open for a man like this. She took a slow, steadying breath, the air rattling in her lungs, and prepared to stand her ground. With Marco's fingers still digging into her arm, Eleanor did not cry out. She did not struggle. Instead, a profound and startling stillness settled over her. She lifted her head, her gaze rising from the floor to meet his. Her eyes, clouded with age but now clear with a purpose as sharp as glass, locked onto his. All the fear and humiliation vanished from her face, replaced by an expression of immense, sorrowful pity. It was not the reaction he wanted. It was not fear. It was not submission. It was judgment. Slowly, deliberately, she used her free hand to open her worn purse one last time. Marco watched, a smirk playing on his lips, assuming she was making a final, pathetic search for the missing coins. But Eleanor's fingers bypassed the coin compartment entirely. They closed around a small, heavy object wrapped in a faded silk handkerchief. She drew it out. With a grace that defied her trembling hands, she unwrapped it. Resting in her palm was a small, tarnished piece of metal, a military pin, an old insignia from a forgotten division, its enamel chipped but its form. A spread-winged eagle over a shield, still distinct. It was Arthur's. It was the pin from his dress uniform, the one he had been awarded for valor, the one he had told her represented not just bravery, but honor. She didn't brandish it like a weapon. She simply held it in her open palm, a silent offering. She then looked directly into Marco's cold, flat eyes. Her voice, when it came, was not a whisper. It was quiet, but it carried the weight of a lifetime, cutting through the thick silence of the store with absolute clarity. "My husband fought for men like you," she said, her tone even, devoid of anger. "He fought for your freedom to be cruel. He believed that even the lowest among us deserved that." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "He was a man of honor." She took a small step back, pulling her arm from Marco's now loosened grip. His surprise had made him falter. "You," she said, her voice dropping slightly, imbued with a final, devastating finality, "have no honor." She didn't wait for a response. She carefully rewrapped the pin, placed it back in her purse, and snapped the clasp shut. The sound was like a gavel falling. Without a backward glance at the spilled milk, the crushed bread, or the stunned faces of her tormentors, she turned and walked toward the door. Each step was measured, erect, dignified. She was leaving with nothing she came for, yet she was taking with her the only thing that mattered. Her spirit was not just intact, it was triumphant. She had not won the battle, but in the war for her own soul, she was undefeated. The moment Eleanor's words, "You have no honor," echoed in the sip and save, the atmosphere in the room fundamentally changed. It was as if a spell had been broken. The shame that had been her burden just moments before now transferred itself to every other person in the store. Marco and his friends stood dumbfounded, the smirks wiped clean from their faces, replaced by a slack-jawed confusion. They had been so certain of their power, and with a few quiet words, this old woman had completely disarmed them. They were no longer predators. They were just petty, cruel boys, exposed and diminished. The young mother, who had been shielding her child, now lowered her hands and looked directly at Marco. Her eyes filled with a cold, clear disgust. She didn't say a word, but her stare was an indictment. The cashier, Kevin, finally moved. He walked around the counter, picked up the crushed loaf of bread, and dropped it into the trash with a loud, definitive thud. It was a small act of rebellion, but it was an act nonetheless. He couldn't meet Eleanor's eyes as she walked past, but he watched her go with a new, dawning sense of respect and profound self-loathing. But the most significant shift came from the corner booth. Jed, the old man who had been nursing his coffee, slowly rose to his feet. His movements were stiff, but his purpose was clear. He watched Eleanor leave, a flicker of something, recognition, perhaps, or memory, in his old eyes. He looked at the tarnished pin she had held, and a lifetime of understanding clicked into place. He knew that symbol. He knew what it meant, and he knew the kind of men who had earned it. He pulled a worn, flip-style cell phone from his pocket, a device as old as his coat. With deliberate, practiced movements, he flipped it open and dialed a number from memory. He turned his back to the room, shielding the call with his body, and spoke in a low, urgent voice. "Preacher," he said, his voice raspy with disuse. "It's Jed. I'm at the Sip and Save on Elm. There's a situation here. It's about Arthur Vance's wife." There was a pause. "Yeah, Arthur's Ellie. She's in trouble." He listened for a moment. "They don't know who she is, but they will." He snapped the phone shut and slid it back into his pocket. He sat back down, picked up his coffee cup, and took a long, slow sip. And then he waited. The whispers of respect had begun, and the thunder was about to answer. It began as a feeling more than a sound, a low-frequency vibration that hummed through the soles of their shoes and rattled the cheap glass bottles of soda on the shelves. Marco and his friends, still reeling from their public emasculation, looked around in confusion. Kevin, the cashier, thought it might be a passing freight train, though the tracks were miles away. Jed, however, didn't even look up from his coffee. He knew that sound. It was the sound of a promise being kept. The vibration grew, deepening into a guttural rumble, then a percussive roar that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. The large plate glass window at the front of the sip and save began to shudder in its frame. Coffee rippled in Jed's cup. The young mother instinctively covered her child's ears again, this time from the sheer, overwhelming volume of the noise. Then they came into view. The first motorcycle, a massive, gleaming Harley-Davidson, turned onto Elm Street, its chrome engine catching the afternoon sun like a starburst. It was followed by 2 more, then 5, then a dozen. Within 30 seconds, the street was flooded. It was a river of steel and leather, an unstoppable tide of roaring engines and blacked-out metal. They poured in from every direction, a coordinated, disciplined arrival that spoke of years of riding together. They were not a gang. They were an army. They filled the street from curb to curb, their headlights cutting through the dusty air. One by one, the engines were cut, the thunderous roar replaced by the rhythmic ticking and clicking of cooling metal, a sound that was somehow even more menacing in its sudden quiet. 200 motorcycles, 200 riders, sitting astride their machines, their faces grim, their eyes fixed on the entrance to the small corner store. The door of the sip and save swung open, the little bell above it giving a pathetic, tinny jingle that was utterly incongruous with the scene outside. The man who entered was built like the mountains he likely rode through. He was tall and broad, with a long, graying beard braided into 2 sections. His leather cut, or vest, was covered in patches, each one a chapter in a long and storied life. But the most prominent patch, sitting over his heart, read President. His face was a roadmap of hard miles and harder fights, but his eyes were intelligent and fiercely calm. This was Preacher. He let the door swing shut behind him, his boots making a heavy, deliberate sound on the linoleum. He didn't look at Marco or his terrified friends. He didn't acknowledge the cashier or the young mother. His gaze swept the room until it found Jed, and he gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. Then, his eyes continued their search, looking for the reason he had just summoned his entire chapter. He was looking for Eleanor. Preacher's presence seemed to suck all the air out of the room. Marco and his 2 friends, who had been the picture of arrogant menace just minutes before, now seemed to shrink. They were frozen, their faces pale with a primal fear they had never known. The tattoo of a snake on Marco's neck seemed to mock him now, a symbol of a predator who had just found himself at the bottom of the food chain. Preacher took another slow step into the store, his gaze finally landing on the puddle of milk and the crushed loaf of bread. His eyes narrowed, and a muscle twitched in his jaw. He didn't need a full explanation. The scene told a story he knew all too well. Jed spoke from his corner booth, his voice quiet but carrying easily in the tense silence. They were disrespecting her, Preacher. Pushed her around. A dispute over a few cents. Preacher's eyes, hard as flint, slowly moved to Marco. He didn't speak. He just looked, and in that look was the weight of 200 men waiting outside, the history of a brotherhood built on ironclad rules, and the cold promise of retribution. But before he addressed the thugs, he needed to confirm what he already knew. His gaze softened almost imperceptibly as he saw the door swing open again. Eleanor, hearing the commotion, had cautiously returned, her face etched with confusion and concern. She saw the man in the leather vest, saw the patches, and her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't seen a cut like that in 20 years. Preacher walked past the frozen trio, his boots leaving clean prints in the spilled milk. He stopped a respectful distance from Eleanor. He didn't tower over her. He somehow managed to meet her at her level, his entire posture one of deference. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Are you Eleanor Vance?" She nodded, her hand instinctively going to the clasp of her purse. "I am. My name is Preacher. I rode with your husband." He gestured vaguely with his thumb towards the patches on his vest. "A long time ago. Arthur, he was one of the first. He founded our charter." The reveal landed with quiet gravity. Arthur wasn't just a member. He was a legend, a cornerstone of their entire way of life. He taught us the code we live by. Preacher's eyes flickered down to her purse. Jed said you showed them his pin. Eleanor's hand trembled as she opened the purse and once again revealed the tarnished eagle. Preacher looked at it, and for a moment, the hard lines on his face softened with a deep, profound reverence. Valor and honor, he said, reciting the inscription he knew by heart. He gave me my first patch, told me it was more than a piece of cloth. It was a promise to protect our own, to never let disrespect stand. He looked up from the pin, his gaze meeting hers, and the full power of the brotherhood was contained in his next words. That promise doesn't have an expiration date, Mrs. Vance. You are our own. You always have been. The full weight of the situation finally crashed down on Marco. This wasn't just some random old lady. She was connected. She was protected. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, greenish pallor. He was trapped between a living legend and 200 of his angriest disciples. Preacher turned his head slowly, his gaze falling upon Marco like a physical weight. The time for quiet respect was over. The time for justice had arrived. Preacher's voice dropped, losing all its warmth, becoming as cold and hard as polished steel. You, he said, pinning Marco with a stare that promised a world of pain. On your knees, it wasn't a request. Marco's legs, suddenly devoid of strength, buckled beneath him, and he sank to the dirty linoleum, his friends quickly following suit like terrified puppets. You will pick up every piece of food you knocked over. You will clean this floor. And then you will pay for this woman's groceries. Preacher paused, his eyes narrowing. For the next year, one of the bikers had entered silently behind Preacher, carrying a bucket and mop from the store's back room. He slammed it down in front of the kneeling trio. With trembling hands, Marco and his friends began to clean, their earlier swagger replaced by the frantic, desperate movements of cornered rats. They scrubbed at the milk, their hands covered in the grime of the floor. They retrieved the dented can of soup from under the shelf. The humiliation was absolute, a perfect and terrible mirror of what they had inflicted on Eleanor just moments before. While they worked, Preacher turned to Kevin, the cashier. Everything she wants. On his tab, he gestured with his chin at Marco. Kevin, shaking, began ringing up not just the bread and milk, but a full cart of groceries that another biker had silently filled and brought to the counter. The community, shamed into action by the biker's fierce loyalty, began to stir. The young mother stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. I saw the whole thing, she said to Preacher. He grabbed her. He threatened her. Jed nodded from his corner. Heard it all. The evidence was overwhelming. The verdict already delivered. When the cleaning and the payment were done, Preacher stood before the kneeling Marco. Now you will apologize. Marco looked up, his eyes pleading. He mumbled a pathetic, I'm sorry. Not to me, Preacher growled. To her. Look her in the eye and tell her what you are. Marco turned his head, his gaze crawling up to meet Eleanor's. She stood with a quiet, unshakable dignity, neither gloating nor pitying. She was simply present. I'm sorry, ma'am, he stammered, his voice cracking. I have no honor. Her words, tasted like poison in his mouth. But the recognition didn't end there. It was about more than punishment. It was about restoration. After escorting the 3 thugs out of the store with a final, chilling warning to never show their faces in this town again, Preacher turned back to Eleanor. Another biker stepped forward, holding something in his hands. It was a brand new leather cut, identical to the ones the members wore, but this one was clean, without any patches except for one, sewn carefully over the heart. It was an exact replica of the tarnished pin Eleanor held, Arthur's insignia of valor and honor. Arthur's old cut was retired with him, as is our way, Preacher said, his voice gentle again. But his legacy belongs to you. This is yours, so that no one ever forgets who you are again. He held it out to her. With a sense of profound, surreal grace, Eleanor allowed him to place it over her thin shoulders. The leather was heavy, smelling of dye and promise. It was a mantle of protection, a symbol of a family she had forgotten she had. The weight of it was grounding, a tangible representation of the love and loyalty that had just re-entered her life. The community watched, their silence no longer one of indifference, but of awe. The evening sun cast long shadows down Elm Street as Eleanor sat on her small, freshly repaired porch swing. The broken step had been fixed, the peeling paint on the railing had been touched up, and the overgrown lawn had been meticulously mowed. The sounds of hammers and quiet, respectful work had filled the air for hours, as the men of the club swarmed her small house, undoing years of neglect in a single afternoon. Her pantry, once nearly bare, was now stocked to overflowing, the result of a dozen silent trips to the grocery store. It was more food than she had seen in years, a bulwark against future hunger. She wore the new leather vest over her simple cardigan. It felt strange and yet deeply, fundamentally right. Its weight was a comfort, a constant, physical reminder that she was no longer alone. A single, gleaming motorcycle was parked at the curb, its rider leaning against a nearby oak tree, keeping a silent, patient watch. He hadn't said a word to her, but his presence was a promise, a sentinel posted against the cruelty of the world. 2 more bikes were parked at the end of the block, silent guardians at the edge of her small kingdom. The main contingent of the Brotherhood had departed an hour earlier. Their exit was the opposite of their arrival. There was no thunder, no chaotic roar. They left in a disciplined, rolling procession, their engines a low, powerful hum that was not a threat, but a reassurance. It was the sound of a promise fulfilled, a deep, resonant lullaby of loyalty fading into the twilight. The sound lingered in the air long after they were gone, a vibration left in the soul of the neighborhood. The community, too, was changed. The Sip and Save owner had come by personally, his face a mask of shame, and offered her free groceries for life. The young mother from the store had brought over a warm, homemade apple pie, her young son shyly handing Eleanor a crayon drawing of a motorcycle. The teenager who had filmed the initial confrontation on his phone had deleted the video and, in a fit of conscience, had been the one to mow her lawn. The biker's honor had proven to be contagious, shaming a dormant decency back to life. Eleanor took a slow sip of the hot tea one of her new guardians had quietly placed beside her. She looked at the single patch over her heart, the silver eagle gleaming in the fading light. She thought of Arthur, of his quiet strength, his unwavering code. He had been gone for 20 years, but his legacy, his brotherhood, had endured. They had not forgotten. In her deepest moment of despair, when she had felt most invisible, they had seen her. They had honored his memory by honoring her. A single tear traced a path through the wrinkles on her cheek. It was not a tear of sadness or of fear, but of a profound and overwhelming gratitude. The world had tried to break her, but Arthur's love, embodied in the rumbling engines and leather-clad knights of his brotherhood, had refused to let her fall. Her dignity was no longer just an internal fortress. It was now a shield held by 200 of the most loyal men she had ever known. And as darkness fell, Eleanor Vance, queen of a forgotten kingdom, finally felt safe. She was home,